this theme of ethics and bias in AI. What does it mean, and why it is important? Why should we like discuss it today? Wait, sorry, I think I have some. A second. Okay, so you can see here just some titles of the articles you could like notice over the last several years about bias happening in different companies, some of the top companies actually. Sometimes it's happening in the, for example, governmental solutions, like for example, solutions built for US police. If you heard something about that as well, we will talk a little bit about that case later. So this is something that probably made us think about the problem of bias and why is that happening, what is this kind of problem, and how we can solve that. So let's just talk a little bit about what bias is. And we can say that
I'm just listening to these guys. We're not recorded, so it's live, but I'm just listening. Better make sure my mic is off. Hold on. It's not supposed to be.
I think someone is not muted. Okay, so at first, let's just talk about what is bias actually. It's we can say that basically it's a systematic distortion of a statistic, or it's some kind of an inclination towards some way of thinking or some opinion or a way of that. And if you talk about bias in AI specifically, it's anomaly in the output which we can see in the output of an algorithm. And by that, it doesn't mean that the algorithm itself is faulty. The problems could be at different stages of the way how we develop the algorithm, what kind of data we use, and so on and so on. There is a lot of aspects to consider while building models. Let's discuss a little bit what are the examples of bias in AI, so we could like understand it in the same way. For example, as you probably heard that there was a algorithm developed for Florida Police Department, and at some point they noticed that it was labeling African American defendants as highly risky, and two times more often than the model was labeling white defendants as risky ones for the ones who will commit the crime again. And this is an example of a model having a bias towards race. Also, sometimes it happens towards specific neighborhoods. For example, if some crimes are made in some neighborhoods, sometimes it happens that the model just inclines towards seeing that these defendants comes from a specific region, and probably this defendant can commit the crime again. Another example about Amazon recruiting system, and they developed a system to evaluate applications of different candidates, and at some point they noticed that this system showed bias against women, so it was accepting more of male applications. And even the most interesting thing about that is that they didn't really use, as far as I remember, predictors about the gender of the candidates, but they used keywords which are usually provided in the resumes, and some of the keywords which were quite influential for the model solutions, for the model giving some decisions, was that the words like executed and so on, which are mostly present in the CVs of male candidates. So in such a way that the model was inclined towards accepting the applications from male candidates. And another case it happened, I think, in 2019. So it's one of the latest cases of bias. Facebook at some point allowed to target people by gender, race, and religion with different commercials. And as a result of that, for example, women could see commercials of job propositions which are like traditionally female jobs, something like nurse work or teachers and so on. And for example, men were seeing commercials of taxi drivers and so on. It's just one example of gender-based bias, but there was also a lot of different problems happening because of that. And fortunately, Facebook prohibited this kind of feature to use in the future for different companies. Okay, so what usually are the reasons of bias, why it's happening to the models that we try to build and we try to make them fair? So at first, it's a cognitive bias, and it means that we already have some kind of a bias in the data that we use for the model. And we don't handle it anyhow, or we introduce this bias when we develop features on the already biased training data. Or we have a lack of data, which means that we don't have enough data about some groups of people, and in such a way, we just don't have diverse enough data for our kind of problem to actually be fair. And why we actually talking about bias as some kind of a problem? Because bias and fairness are like two different sides of the same coin, and I think we all want our solutions to be fair. And when we don't really pay attention to how our models behave, we promote discrimination of certain groups of people or certain opinions and behaviors. And also, it basically decreases accuracy of our solutions, because it doesn't really depict the complexity of our world. It doesn't really depict the different behaviors of different groups of people. So it may seem at some point that those solutions are accurate enough on the data set that we use, but they might not be actually that accurate in the real world. And we can say that, okay, it's so important, we should pay more attention to detecting bias. But what we can, like, why it is so hard to do that, and to do it just, at the moment when we build models or when we evaluate the data set that we use? Well, at first, I would say that bias is related to ethics. So there are some of the general things which we all understand, like discrimination by race, by gender, by religion. But there are also some specific characteristics which can be very different for different countries, different parts of the world. For example, for some region, it's culturally accepted, and for another, it's not. So we don't really have a unified definition of bias. And another problem is that usually we don't really include social context when we plan what are we going to do with our models. For example, we decide what kind of data we're going to use to build a model, what kind of features we can build, how we can build the model. But we don't really think okay, right now in the world, there are some specific events happening, and we should look whether that influences our data. Usually that's not how it works, and it's a problematic point that social context is missing out in the while planning. Also, it can be really, really hard to find when and where bias was introduced, because it can happen basically at any point of the life cycle of the model. development, and it can be really hard to understand whether it is biased actually, and if the model is biased, why it is biased, and how we can fix that. And also, bias detection is not really a part of the development process. And by that, I mean that we don't really have libraries that we can just import and use to say that, okay, our model is biased or our data set is biased. It's all really still in the process of research and experimentation. And in such a way, we don't really have any steps in our development process when we say like, okay, here we check whether the model is biased when we evaluate the model or when we build features or when we get the data set, usually really up to data scientists who work on that problems and whether they actually even think about that. So let's dive into the discussion about that. And I think we will talk about the state of bias and ethics in AI right now and how we can handle that, and also the role of Gdpr as well in this fight, and a lot of more interesting stuff. Thanks for hearing this introduction. So I would like to proceed by asking at first, Yulia, can you tell us what was your experience with bias, and when was the first time when you actually encountered something like that and you started to think about this as a problem that we need to pay attention to?
Hi. So actually, I can't say I encountered the biased algorithms in my personal work. I do encounter bias as in the field of NLP. We work a lot with the word embeddings, and word embeddings are basically a way of vectorizing words or text, and they are trained on large amounts of text, like Wikipedia or scraping the web. And the text naturally reflects all the current and past biases. So it can have a gender bias, it can have ethnicity bias, whatever. So, so more in the context of learning of what word embeddings do, I also read the paper, which is, I think, quite famous, that is named Man to Computer Programmer as Woman to Homemaker. So it talks about the fact that some word vectors are closer to each other, which reflects the context they are used in. And yeah, so typical examples like this is something that was analyzed, and the ways of tackling this bias mathematically as well are explained in this paper. So that's my most like, you know, personal encounter with bias.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I haven't thought that there could be some bias in the embeddings, but it totally makes sense. I think I just didn't really pay attention to that.
Yeah. The good thing is that it can actually be de-biased, which is, you know, not so easy in real life.
And Veronica, can you say how you encountered bias for the first time, or did you have any cases where you decided that it's an important problem to focus on, or you just heard about that and how you came to understanding of that problem?
Yeah, I personally didn't encounter with bias in machine learning, but in Captify, almost around a year ago, we started to talk more about diversity and inclusion, and I personally started to think more about it. And the more I think about discrimination, the more I understand that it's really important to think about it and to deal with it somehow. And also in data science perspective, it's also useful to know that the models can be biased, that products can be biased and discriminative. Yeah, and for example, in Captify, we talk a lot about some solution which connected with these questions, and also on some of the meetings we were proposed to some of questions which we can discuss, and one of them was to make our work less biased because of Gdpr and Black Lives Matter, all those questions. Yeah, and at the time I started to think about this question, and yeah, and this point of time I first time encountered with this. Yeah.
How do you think if we just knew more about what bias is, and if we had more well-defined understanding of that, maybe most of our models, or even all of our models, are biased? Do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking about it too, and I think a lot of models really is biased, are biased in different businesses, but not all companies, and not a lot of companies think about it. Yeah, and there are a lot of reasons why it's like this. Yeah, I can share my thoughts about it. For example, not for all businesses, it's really obvious that their model can be biased. For example, I personally didn't think about it before I started to know more about that models can be biased and product can be biased. Yeah, and it's first reason. Second one is that some companies can know that their model can be biased, but it's really hard to build unbiased model and with the same performance that it was with biased models. And for example, small companies can't afford them to build teams for research on this topic. I think only big companies can afford it, and they have a research department which can which can deal with this problem. And for big companies, it's like more reasonable because a lot of people talk about their products, and it's important for them not to be discriminative, not to build discriminatory models, because it's it's like people to talk about it, and it's bad for them mostly. Yeah, and also if companies and the companies are driven by their performance, by their revenue, and they prefer, if this question can be hide, they prefer not to spend more time on this research. Yeah, and because of this, and one more reason why, it's that there is no law which can say that you behave not right, that your model is discriminative or something. Yeah, and so we don't know rules which we have to follow. Yeah, and so I have seen one article where from European Parliament, where they described the current situation about AI and ethics in AI, and what has done already, and what is the gaps. And from this information, I think that they started to think about it, like governments of some maybe countries or some maybe someone started to think that yeah, we need to deal something somehow with it, and like create the rules, and yeah. Thank you.
Yulia, what do you think about that? Like, what if we knew more about bias and it was kind of part of the process, how we develop it in the companies, or part of the rules? Would it be easier for you and for others to understand that some of the models are biased, and maybe we could come to that like earlier? What do you think about that?
I think the first step is probably to be aware of bias, that the people just know that something that they create might have a bias. Eventually, in early steps, the things that can be done, I mean, as you mentioned, is to have a more diverse data sets. Or if we have labelers, to make sure the labelers maybe are not biased themselves, because sometimes it's you know, the labelers themselves are biased. If we use some off-the-shelf models like word embeddings, we can think of debiasing those. Other things that can be done to debias is regulation, maybe, because I know like in a medical domain, there is heavy regulation, whether it's a device or software or anything is regulated to not harm people. But these algorithms, they might harm people just as well. If it comes to, I don't know, releasing someone from prison, authorizing someone a mortgage, or even, you know, harmless stuff like social media can actually be harmful. So I think there are already regulations in place. I don't know how much they are adapted, but it's something that is being worked on. So that could, you know, bring more responsibility into developing these kinds of algorithms. That's pretty much.
Yeah, I agree with you that awareness of bias is like one of the key things before doing anything else, and before introducing any like regulations and well-defined processes to that. I can say that from my personal experience, I didn't think that models that I was working on, that they were biased, until I got to know more about this kind of question. And for example, when I was working on a credit scoring system, and I just decided to evaluate that just because I was interested in this topic, I realized that some of the clients who were from the neighborhoods close to the ones where like fraudsters usually were coming from, that the model was biased towards saying that those are like frauds when they were actually not. So there is like really a lot of things which might seem, I would say, harmless. Like we may remove gender, race predictors and so on, but sometimes some of the other things are indicating something to the model which can be introducing bias in the future.
Yeah.
So Veronica, how do you think, what is the current state of bias right now in AI, like in different countries? Maybe you can talk about some of the differences you see, or about companies you know about, and how is it right now in your company? How do you feel about that?
From one point of view, that we a bit succeed in this question because we at least start to think about it. We know the problem, and we know, But from other side, it's so I understand that we really far from really good situation in this question, because yeah, as I mentioned before, we don't have really rules. We don't know exactly what is ethical, what is not ethical. Yeah, and yeah, as I understand that in a lot of companies don't think about bias, and it's not like it's a new topic, and not a lot of people are aware of it. And yeah, and also we have like in humans society, we have like bias. We all are biased to something. Yeah, and it's first of all, it's hard to understand if you are not aware of it. And yeah, it's I think we are far from really good position of this question. But it's good that we at least talk about it, and somehow to try to deal with it if we really can see that model is biased. And if it's big companies more often like think about it and deal with it when their customers or they see such a situation in their models, and yeah, they sometimes try to deal with this problem. Yeah.
Yulia, what do you think? Like, have we succeeded something already? Like, I mean collectively, all the data scientists and specialists in data-driven companies, in terms of eliminating bias, or we are actually still have a long way ahead of us?
I think we have a long way ahead of us. I think AI is only now starting to be used at scale commercially. And when it starts to be used like that, the problems emerge. And since they are only now starting to emerge, I think only now we start thinking about tackling them. So I think it's a matter of time until we will find the solutions. But right now it's just digging out the problem. That's the stage we are at, as I see it.
Yeah, but there is, I would say, quite a lot of fuss from some of the big companies at different conferences and overall in the news. So it may seem like everybody is thinking about that. Do you think is it like harmful for actually creating some practical solutions, or on the contrary, maybe it motivates others to participate as well?
No, I think it's great to create these kind of solutions. I mean, I do see cases when companies detect the bias and then they just stop using the algorithm, or maybe they stop using it for a while until they fix it. But I think if bias can be fixed by better data or better some, I don't know, mathematical solutions, then definitely it should be, of course, it's a good thing to do, definitely. I think it's easier to solve it than the bias we have, you know, between us.
Yeah, but we kind of expect our algorithms to be fair and to help us to solve the problems that we have, but it turns out that on the contrary, we kind of influence our algorithms to be as biased as we are.
Yeah, we want the algorithms to be fairer than we are.
Yeah. Veronica, how do you think we can fix this situation? Like what we can do at the early stages, as early as possible, when we try to build some algorithms for different problems?
First of all, we have to take a look on data, because in data we can have some disparities, we can have some stereotypes, human stereotypes, which which is like in us, in people, like it, and it's historical. it like we came in as historically, yeah, and all these situations can be shown in data. And when algorithms, when machine learning models is training on such type of data, they take the same logic from data as we have. And the same disparities and the stereotypes. For example, in different occupations, we have imbalances. And for example, if models will train on such a data, for example, for searching of candidates, for example, so based on it, models can be biased because, for example, for searching software engineers, and it's obvious that we have more more men in IT, and we have to think about it that the model can use more can be biased against gender or something. Yeah, and there are really a lot of situations where models can be biased, and it's reality that some disparities can exist there. So, and the first step is take a look on data. And for example, in some cases, data can be created from human judgments. For example, when the same situation for scoring candidates or something, if the model is trained based on some manager's judgment, it means that model can learn the same behavior of that person who do judgment. And the same stereotypes which humans have. And yeah, so we need to take a look on data, but it's not a really easy question in such a situation. Yeah. But in your early stages, it's always to take a look on data.
Yulia, how do you think what can help us to detect bias in data? Maybe, I don't know, we need to have an open bank of unbiased data sets, or what we can do about having unbiased data for our problems?
Detect bias in data. I need to think about. I think what you can do is try and evaluate your data indirectly after developing the model, which is, I think, also an early stage. Even if you build the model, but before you start to use it at scale, it is an early stage. So often models are treated like a black box. We put some input, we get some output, and the main target is to get like high accuracy, high F1, and we don't stop to think what were the features that made the prediction, and what is actually making the model do the prediction as it does. So I think the important thing is to use tools, and there are available tools as to understand why a model does the prediction that it does. And maybe from that you can discover a bias, and then you can go back to the data and see if it comes from there. For example, there is like a famous study, I think, and then it led to develop a toolbox that it's called LIME, and they use a way of evaluating the prediction in a local way, and it can be applied to all kinds of predictive algorithms, but especially it's useful for this, neural networks or black box kind of algorithms. They had like this example where they train an algorithm to classify between wolves and dogs, and it was working pretty well. and they were happy, but when they tried to evaluate the features that led to this prediction, they detected that the reason is having a snow in the picture. So wherever there was snow, it would be a wolf, and wherever there was no snow, it was a dog. So actually the algorithm was, wrong, but not biased, but other cases can indicate bias. Another way would be to validate the algorithms a little bit better. So usually the people who validate are the developers themselves, who are quite maybe blind to the biases. But if you let a more diverse team validate your algorithm, you can detect the biases, and the biases can be in the data or maybe in the model or in the features. But that's an approach.
Yeah, but when we see very good accuracy or other metric, it's very hard to get rid of some some features which are
that's the thing.
Unfortunately are like not good to use.
Yes, so you are greedy. You see your high accuracy and you say that's a great model, but eventually it might not be so good in real life.
Mm-hmm.
If you put the dog in some snow, then all the predictions.
Yeah, but it also could mean that this model is like accurate in the short term, and it's accurate for some of the training data that we have, but it might not be that accurate in the real world when we just deploy that model. So yeah, but it's always hard decision to make.
Yeah. But just spend more time on testing. Just invest time in that, in testing with new data, with untested data, and let diverse people or like the target population test your algorithm, because the developers, they might be, blind to their own biases, and if they are the only one who test, they will not find it.
You also mentioned that interpretation of models kind of helps to detect bias. But what do you think about the fact that it's still like not really straightforward way, like because even when we evaluate every like solution that the model makes for different records, it's still not that I would say not 100% correct interpretation of the model. How do you think we could, what can we use to kind of find bias in the models as well?
Yeah, I guess, everything you'll get from this after the development is sort of approximation. So obviously what Nika said about analyzing the data better, sometimes we know there is a bias in the data, either the distribution is unequal of the categories, or even like a bias towards English, and preferring English language, English examples, English sets. So sometimes we know that the bias is there. We can, do some statistical analysis of the data to detect some, skewness towards something. But eventually, I think it's the combination of this and what you get as a result, and how you test it is the best way to, find the most you can.
Yeah, I agree. Veronica, how do you think, do we actually maybe need a team of QAs for that, or just data scientists and other specialists in the team should be like trained to detect bias in the models?
It's a very hard question, really. So I think maybe first of all, we have to start from diversity in the team. So I have heard recently a lot about to build diverse team. It's a really good solution. And for example, in America and in Europe, people really talk a lot about this. For example, I have heard about one example of photo editing application when one filter of that application makes black people more white. And I think that the developers of this application really wasn't like diverse team, because if this team will be diverse, this problem won't exist really, because for example, in such a situation I can feel really bad if it happens with my photo or something. Yeah, it's just as example. And also yeah, that's it what I wanted to say.
What do you think about that, Yulia? What can you add to this question?
About having diverse teams?
Yeah, and also maybe about delegating evaluation of our models to maybe QA teams who are focused more on the detecting bias, or just training specialists that we have who are actually working on the models.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think there should be like a dedicated test set or a dedicated phase in model development, especially ones that, you know, affect people in a negative way. I think it is good to have a team of people maybe with extra knowledge about the topic, or maybe just people who are not the diverse people, diverse team, or maybe, I don't know, a set of test cases that can detect diversity, but just, you know, have a separate testing set dedicated to this question.
Yeah, and that you probably need to have a well-defined understanding of bias to create such a data set.
Yeah, it reminds me one situation, which one case which I saw in the internet. So one big tech company in US, they produce their their product into the cities, but they provide their product not in the all neighborhoods in the city. And when analysis was done about all cities in the US, and the majority of excluded neighborhoods was mainly Black. And when the company was asked why it happens, they answered that it's not, so we didn't use race feature or just distribution of like neighborhoods, people which live in neighborhoods. They said that they just wanted to cover as many as possible people, their users, and yeah, they didn't just like didn't know that like race is correlated with target variable, and sometimes it can be not so really obvious like output of the product or of the model. Yeah.
But do you think that? Yeah, sorry.
Yes, and sometimes it's really hard to like cover some specific case, but some test cases or something.
Yeah, but do you think that like anonymizing data is helpful when we don't really know a lot about our users, since it's actually can be really influential for models accuracy?
No, it plays a bad game with bias in models, because for example, when we build model and we have sensitive characteristics in our data, and in that case, when we don't use sensitive characteristics in our models, we always can build training set which is balanced for different groups of like characteristics, for example, in gender or race, etc. Also, when we build model, we can calculate correlation between the sensitive characteristics and the target variable, and it also plays a big role in models. And also when we test, we also can test by each group when we have this data, but when we don't have data in which we can test it, in which we can, based on which we can gather data set and do all the stuff which I mentioned, we really don't know whether our model is biased or not. And more likely these models will be biased because we are not aware of anything. Yeah.
Yeah, but what if like, yeah.
But from another point of view, some now companies can use these sensitive characteristics as features in models. In this situation, yes, it's good that we will not, with GDPR, for example, we will not have this characteristics, just not to use these features, these characteristics as features. But yeah, in this case, it's good. But in that case, which I mentioned previously, it's bad.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yulia, how do you think, what is the role like of GDPR right now in fighting bias in AI? Is it helpful, or you don't see any differences from using GDPR right now in AI specifically?
So GDPR is about data protection, right? So I think it's two sides of a coin. For us as ML engineers, we often want to use these specific features to be able to target better and to be able to develop more accurate and maybe even more diverse models. We want to know maybe some search history of a user. Sometimes we want to use images of a user. But unless users give explicit consent to using this data, it's not ethical to use that. So I think, generally speaking, if we can have consent from users, then it's okay to use, I guess, any sort of data that the user consented for. But if it's a non-consented data, then it's not fair to develop algorithms by it, and also it's not fair to target by it. So, so in that way, like GDPR is it's good. It protects the people, but sometimes it's a problem for us as engineers, and yet we have to think of more creative ways, or really just anonymize people, or get their consent. These are the options.
Yeah, it definitely complicates the process of model development.
Yeah.
Veronica, what do you think about GDPR introduction, how it influenced bias and ethics in AI specifically?
Yeah. As I mentioned, that influence a lot of it slowed down our research in how to build less biased models. I think maybe I am not aware a lot, but as I understand, yeah, it from that point of view, how we can deal with bias in our models. So we need to know who is that user, and yeah, but and yes, as Yulia said, it really will become more hard to build good models for businesses. Yeah, and yeah, that's everything which I wanted to say.
Yeah, but I think it also kind of can be a first step towards making people aware of bias, and that can be introduced to the data, because otherwise, when we don't really have any legal consequences, sometimes it seems like, okay, it's not really that important. Like I remember when I was working in the Ukrainian startup, and GDPR was just like introduced at that moment, and I was saying that let's do more about evaluating our models, but it was really hard to prove to anyone that it's important, since it wasn't really like influencing Ukrainian business specifically, because GDPR wasn't really officially introduced in Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about the things that we can do like early when we try to develop the models. Yulia, what do you think we can also do except for evaluating the data sets? What can be like the well-defined component of the process or what is like must do and must have in life cycle of a model development, so we could remove bias from our models?
Well, it's things that I think are good for any case for models, bias or not bias. So some things that I touched on were better validation of the algorithms by, I don't know, having a better validation set or a better validating team. One other thing that I think often is kind of overlooked is the maintenance of algorithms. So they are developed, deployed, and used forever and ever, and the people don't always stop to, you know, recreate data, rebuild the model, redeploy, and as a result, the model gets outdated and also biased. So a better maintenance of the algorithms, I think, is a good way to eliminate bias as well. To again open the black boxes, as I said, and try to understand better why everything is being predicted as is, and also have a more restrictive control over this kind of predictions, because often people, companies, they just look for the revenue, but there should be some, you know, ethical limitation that is external that can help controlling the bias, as it is done in medical devices. You know, you can't go and just have a medical study with people as much as you like. You need to get approvals, and then it's being monitored. So I think this should be also part of the process.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Veronica, what you can think of, like what kind of processes for this must do except for evaluating the data sets to eliminate bias in the models?
So sorry, can you repeat?
What kind of things we can do like during the process of models development to eliminate bias, except for evaluating the data set? Like that was the early stage, and what we can do like during development.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, for example, for classification tasks, we can not only for classification, I mean for supervised learning, we can take a look on features and also on sensitive characteristics, and understand what is the relation between these characteristics and target variable. From this point, a lot of bias can be like born. And also when we evaluate model, we should take a look, like evaluate our model not only overall test set, we have to evaluate it per group. And understand whether we have the same accuracy or whatever for each group. And also, I would like to say that yes, diverse team will help in this question too. Yeah, we really mentioned a lot today that can be done with models, and yeah.
Do you think that using models which are easier to interpret it could be the way, or it's also quite possible to automate how we evaluate the models that we already use, regardless of their complexity?
Yeah, sometimes if we, for example, if we have this possibility to do model like simple, we can understand what is under the hood, but not always we can build like simple models. And yeah, sometimes we have to deal with really complex models. Yeah, for example, when we talk about computer vision, it's really can be visible that the model is biased or not. It just can like you have to like take a look on enough examples and understand this. But when we talk about like this how it's called, like simple data, table data, it's sometimes can be really hard to detect this.
Yeah, I agree with you. What else do you think is necessary to pay attention to when like data scientist starts working on the project in terms of like having unbiased model?
Oh, first of all, like company has to be interested in this question, because if you don't really have time for build to like research more about this question, it's like it's almost impossible to build unbiased models. Yeah. What else? I really don't know. Yulia, maybe you know.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is anything that we didn't say yet. And just
Yeah.
think we pretty much covered all the things.
Yeah. Also, we already discussed what we can do like to detect bias, but if we think about it, actually kind of slows down the work, and sometimes we have to justify that to supervisors why we need to work on something more to kind of research these kind of things, when I would say a lot of companies care more about revenues than having ethical models. And how do you think we can do that, and how we can justify that, Yulia?
Well, we as engineers can explain that bias is not something is always very obvious. So if you think you don't have bias, it doesn't mean you don't have it. It just means maybe that you didn't try to find it. But otherwise, there are examples of companies that are punished now because of having biased algorithms, and this can be brought as an example. Also, as said, I think it's a matter of time until more tools will be developed and more regulations. So maybe when we have better tools to evaluate bias, I think I've seen several tools that are being developed. And if we have more, like easy to use out of the shelf tools, it's not as time consuming, and enforced regulation. Even if you don't like it, you are obligated to do it, and that can also help.
Yeah,
Go on.
Yeah, I think that enforced regulations could be really helpful in that case, since sometimes it's really hard to prove that it's important.
Yeah, it sounds like idea for startup because it it wasn't done yes for now, and it can be area for building startups. Like we will get rid of bias of your data or something like this.
Yeah, I've seen a tool when I was preparing. I've seen a tool. I see it's called AI Fairness 360, and it kind of, I don't know how it does it, but it covers all topics of fairness in your data. I don't know. I need to read more. But bottom line, tools are starting to be developed, and this LIME algorithm that I talked before. So it's in the process.
Yeah, and some of the platforms which are like AutoML platforms, they are also, as far as I know, trying to like focus on that subject as well. But I think it's hard, at least for me, it is hard to use something when I don't really know how they developed that and how did they kind of interpreted bias, what is bias in their opinion and how they track that.
Yeah.
Veronica, how do you think, like, how are you going to maybe start in your work to detect bias? What are maybe the small steps that everyone can do there?
I will start from understanding what is like sensitive characteristics in our data. Is it like, for example, can be divided by genders and by race, etc. And when I create like the data set for training set for models, I just try to like compare models with training data where we have equivalent amount of data of different groups, and we with not like the same amount of different groups data in different groups. Yeah, and take a look whether this model will be biased or not to some specific group. Yeah. And it really depends on the model which I will build. Yeah, for example, it's also interesting for computer vision to do something if model works differently with different skin colors, and I will behave like this.
And Yulia, what would you do in your work, in your daily work, to eliminate bias?
I'm tempted to say nothing, but no, I'll think. Listen, I can definitely spend more time on detecting what are the important features when I build the model, and see if anything, looks like a suspicion of bias. I think we work a lot with UK and English-based data, and I think it also kind of a sort of bias because smaller countries are less popular languages, they get less accurate predictions that don't take like all the cultural or all the diversity of countries that are not English speaking. So I'll try to pay more attention to using data from other countries as well. Stuff like that. And maybe I don't plan to debias word embeddings at the moment, but it could be an interesting exercise as well to try and do that.
Yeah. And can you think of some of the maybe funny cases that you've heard about bias in AI, or at least something that was funny at some point?
I really didn't find any funny story for me, really, because like in general, discrimination, it's not like funny. And yeah, maybe there were some like maybe models or something which was done just by fun. But yes, I really don't know how to answer these questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen stuff online. I don't think it's funny. I think it's something more of insulting, scary, I don't know, worrying. But for example, I think now it's a little bit better, but even like a year ago, if you would look on Google for jailed people or prisoners or mugshots, you are like almost 100% of the things you will see are Black people. I think now, I think they are taking care of that because it was very obvious. Gender inequality still exists. I mean, a year ago, if you would print a programmer, you would get only males. Now I think they fixed that, but say you go a little bit deeper and you type mathematicians, then you will get almost 100% males. And if you see a result that is female, at least on Google search, it will almost always be things like the 9 most famous female mathematicians, the 5 most famous female mathematicians. Like males are mathematicians, but females are so seldom mathematicians that you can rank them, you know, into a group of 5. And biases like that are still, I mean, just have a short look on Google and you will see lots of biases that still, you know, circle the web.
Yeah, we have several questions in the chat. So, okay. The first one is, what about regulating AI? From Peter. Can you, like, I don't know, expand maybe this question? Because we talked a little about Gdpr and that regulations are important. What do you mean by regulating AI in general? If it's comfortable, you can speak up or just write in the chat.
Me write in the chat? Or...
Okay,
No,
let's.
Yeah, Yulia,
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, cool. Right. So yeah, what? No, I was just. I mean, you did address it a bit, and I think I wrote that about the same time you did talk about it. But I mean, there's. You do talk a lot about the technical applications on how to you know, clean up the data and make sure the algorithms are not too black box, and I think that's all good. And you know, the raising awareness, I think that all those things are good, but I also think, in my personal opinion, that there has to be some sort of regulatory framework around AI, one which is largely missing. We have the GDPR, but that's obviously one very small piece of the puzzle, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And there has to be far more reaching regulatory arms, if you like, or bodies that address this. But I don't sincerely know how to do that. But in terms of, you know, rights and responsibilities, if something goes wrong and if there is a bias and expressed through an algorithm, or the outcome is clearly perhaps even criminal, who bears responsibility for that, right? And those type of questions. Where's the regulatory framework to ensure that there are no infringements on well, law to begin with, then ethics to follow, or the other way around. But that's, I think, I mean, I would love to hear your opinions on that. Where does regulation fit in a broader sense?
Well, I can try and answer that. So I think like there is a regulation, like law, clear directives and legal consequences on developing a software, especially in the context of medical devices, or in the cases of GDPR. I think similar directives can be developed that address the development and use of AI. And the companies that are, you know, developing AI, and this is their bread and butter, they would need to comply with these directives and prove that they did some effort to comply with them, and get some, approval. And at least then, I don't know if not everything can be eliminated, but at least some can be eliminated, and at least they will take some legal responsibility on the matter. I think it's something that can be developed in Europe or wherever.
Yeah, I think as well that we talk more about technical parts because of this process, because we are the one focusing on this right now, and we are developing models, and this is something what concerns us and what we can do. But having some regulations would be great as well, and I think that could be a huge help to the cause, and it would help as well to justify why we need to work on that. Veronica, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, yeah, I agree with you girls. And yeah, as with GDPR, so companies really didn't start to work on in this area if GDPR is not be like law. Yeah, and in this question also it has to be law so that for companies to start to work in this direction, because it's now it's only a question of moral and ethics. Yeah, not. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question. Okay, so I also see an interesting story about the GNOME in the chat from Helen. If you want to, you can speak up about that.
Yeah, I actually read about it in the Site Reliability Engineering book, the GNOME story. So long story short, they had an error in their algorithm, and when you would look for shoes, one of the results would be a GNOME on eBay, and they couldn't find how to fix it, like how to stop this GNOME showing up. But luckily, it was the only GNOME in one piece, so they just bought it.
They were probably hoping that no one will ever post anything like that on eBay, so that problem wouldn't reoccur. Okay, another question is from Mary. What do you think can or should be done if the only data you have is known to be biased? For example, your product's users are mostly men, or until certain time, other users weren't participating in providing data? That's a very interesting question. Who wants to start answering that question?
Maybe if really mostly when users are mostly men, maybe like first of all, model which we have to build for such a product can be like so it can be biased, but it can be like not like harmful. And yeah, so it really depends on the model. And yeah, but if it's harmful, so yeah, I really don't know, because I'm not so like so in this like questions, because I really didn't work and didn't play with data, didn't play with models. But yeah, I think that in the internet there is maybe some solutions for such a situation, and it can be searched. But I think that maybe if it's mostly men, maybe it's not a like question of discrimination or something in that situation.
What do you think about that, Yulia?
So let me just make sure that I understand the question. The question is, we want to build a model that takes into account men and women in like in the usage of it, but the data for training that we have is only for men. Is that the question?
Yeah, it's
Sorry,
kind of.
if I can just clarify, it was my question
Yeah,
was
sure.
poorly structured. Sorry about that. Yeah, I meant that sometimes I assume there are situations when you just don't have the data for like other groups, and let's say that you have users that are men and women, but for some reason only men were providing the data as like feedback, so you can train better on only known to be biased data, and you kind of know that you might provide like wrong results for other groups. I know about this kind of situation because, for example, before, like if we look at the history, like women were not really participating in a lot of things, in a lot of researches. So now we kind of suffering that lots of algorithms are not really working for women, especially in medical studies and things like that. So I was wondering if you have any opinions on this. I hope that I made it better this
Yeah,
time.
I think I understand better now. So in the case of like an unbiased data set, so I think if you have a minority group, like, I don't know, minority of women versus men, then you can amplify this group with different means. You can maybe upsample the group, or you can create some synthetic samples that are from a similar distribution to the group you want to, overemphasize. You can also downsample the majority group, let's say a group of men. This is something you can do. You can also like artificially fix the weights of the model to give more preference to the minority groups. I think it's really hard to simulate a group when you absolutely don't understand what data the group may have. But if you have a minority group, then you can use some, some mathematical means to overemphasize this group. So, I mean, if you don't have any example from this group and you can't simulate it, then I think it's going to be hard to learn it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I can add that I think there is always a choice when we like don't have enough data. We can just wait for some time to gather that kind of data, or again we can just build the model on the data that we have and deploy that, but also monitor over time and see maybe we get some more users with from the groups that we wanted to describe but we couldn't before, and we could like retrain those models and just monitor them in the process.
Yeah, it can be a closed loop also, because if you build a biased model, you target a biased group of people, and it's harder to collect maybe this minority group because they, not being addressed. But again, anyways, collecting more data is important.
Yeah, and it's also hard to understand whether model is biased in such a situation, because we have like not enough data for a minority group, and like we can detect even if model is biased or not to some group.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Mary. And we have another question. It's from Christina. It's very unlikely that big companies will ask for regulations themselves, which means it's on us to write to our representatives to ask for better regulations. Do you agree with that or not?
I'm really not sure that our representatives also want to be like also want to ask about regulations, because regulations is always like make work harder, and I think it will go from government, maybe from like when question of moral and ethics will be really important in our society. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that the top-down approach is probably more effective because otherwise we kind of rely on the morals of individuals, and it's harder to like find more motivated people and those who are like just cannot justify why they should work on something and focus on discovering bias and ethics when the company doesn't really care about that. Yulia, would you like to add something to that question?
No, I agree with Nika. I think it's going to come from the legal direction, maybe a couple of lawsuits where the companies will be sued for millions, and this will raise more awareness, and maybe then they will have some more interest on their side, but eventually it will come from the legal direction. I mean, I don't know what individuals will be asking for this unless they have some, clear interest in this.
Thank you for your question. We have another question. It's from Emily. Actually, there is two of them. I'm surprised that I keep hearing if the model is biased. My assumption is bias will always exist in the AI if it exists in the real world. So the first question is, can and should we use the found bias to influence and change the way we work?
What do you mean the model is always biased? I mean,
as I understood that, but if Emily wants to clarify the question for us, she can do that by writing in the chat or speaking about that. But as I understood that, that we always have bias in the world, maybe we should change that instead of focusing on the models, because the models will always be biased because they kind of represent the world we have.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a biased model. I mean, if it's predicting things in a equal way, then it's okay. I mean, it's not necessarily something to fix. It's only when it, prefers one group over the other in a negative way is when it's something we need to fix.
Yeah, it's like in real life. So we humanity is not is biased too in different questions, and but we try to be less biased to some groups of people, and because of this we talk about AI, that we also want to be less biased when we build models, and the reason why we talk about it is that we just want to be more ethical in this case too, as in real life.
Yeah, I just think that it's probably easier to teach an algorithm to be fair than to convince all the people about some of the morals that they should abide to that. And
and I wanted also to say that there are more easy tasks and less easy tasks. For example, when we talk about some judgment, some models which help police, it's really like a hard question, and maybe we need to spend a lot of time to build really good model, as in real life too. But also there are a lot of easier questions where we really know what is bias and what is not bias, and what is good and what is bad, and what has to be done. Yeah. So I wanted to summarize what I said. I wanted to say that for some simple solution, for some simple task, we can find enough solution really good solution, like ethical solution. But for some questions, it can be not really even found.
Yeah, I agree. There was also a second question. Does anyone have an example of an unbiased model?
Yeah, I don't know, a model that can tell you if it's an apple or a pear or a car or a train, or I don't think it's biased. I don't know, a model that can say if something is, I don't know, positive or negative, to say it, meaning to a statement. I guess it's also not biased. I don't know, recommender systems often, not often, sometimes can be not biased. I mean, they are biased, but the data, you know, recommending something that will work for you. And then you say, well, great, it works for me. So I don't think it's like a bias, because it's by design meant to give you a recommendation of something that you would like. So again, I don't think it's a bias.
Yeah, it's like risky to like bad situation really in this conversation. So we really didn't talk about something good in AI, and it seems like we have really all models biased in this world.
Yeah, not all of them are biased, and not all biases are bad.
Yes, thank you for your question, Emily. And we also have a comment from Helen that she just Googled programmer, and on the first screen there was only one woman. That's a disappointment. I think Google needs to work on the models.
I think they detect that we have this women who code the conversation, and because of this, it show us only women. Yeah, it was a joke. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Mary. It sounds like making algorithms unbiased can potentially fall into positive discrimination. Not necessarily a bad thing, but controversial. Do you have any opinions, ideas about that?
Well, I don't know, maybe biasing algorithm to suggest more jobs that are historically less suggested to women can create a positive bias. Or I don't know, giving loans to people who are economically deprived. Sometimes, you know, just adding some noise to the system can be a positive effect of a bias, you know. These are my ideas.
Yeah, I think it's like related to ethics again, that we cannot say like for sure that it's a negative or positive thing. Then we just can look at the way how it influences the product and behaviors of the customers and users of this product. What do you think about that, Veronica?
I really don't have what to answer on this question really. Sorry.
Okay, we have another question. I saw the NVIDIA showed that they can treat serious illnesses via AI. Do other companies can do now? Like, I think the question is about whether companies can treat serious illnesses right now using AI.
Treat or diagnose?
I think
treatments.
I don't know about treatments. I know it's being used to diagnosis, like a lot of work with the MRI images to detect the tumors automatically, or you know, ultrasound or PET images. I don't know if it's being used to treatment. It's being used to diagnosis. I know that I'm pretty sure there are algorithms to, I don't know, like take measures from a subject and then kind of recommend the type of disease that might be, you know, a flu or more serious than flu. I think most doctors in UK use that. So stuff like that I know in diagnosis. I don't know if something for treatment.
Yeah, I think I have heard about that AI. So there is model or models that can well, like find solution how to treat some diseases, and this treatment is shown to doctors, and doctor can say yes, it's right or it's not right, and sometimes it can help doctors to like find the right solution for this for some specific situations.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
in
what I'm.
in
But
that case,
name,
it's possible.
yeah, but name of companies I don't remember from that article.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, hope we answered your question. Okay, we have question. Is there any illegal sides of the building model or being independent of any company? Could you maybe explain what you meant by this question?
I mean, many of the developers work on the work with the companies, but some developers don't work with the companies. What is the rules for the what to pay attention for during their jobs?
You mean like if some of the specialists are working, like for example, freelance and independently, and
Yes,
how it
yes,
differs? Yeah.
yes.
I think that still they can be proactive about some of the things, and even if they do some specific projects for different companies, they can still think about bias and introduce that as an important question to the company they are making a project for. Veronica, Yulia, maybe you want to add something?
So I really didn't get. So it's like one person who can build unbiased models can like work for different companies and help them with it, or what was like question about?
Yeah, I mean, if someone if someone works on the models but she works on the freelance job or by self, there are rules. That are they any rule for the follow up?
What rules they have to follow up, right?
Yeah, yes.
I would say that probably like existing regulations like GDPR, they don't really cover individual work, but they still can focus on that, and they can still like follow these rules. Why not? I think that would improve models in general.
And I think also speaking about legal, you already have the laws like anti-discrimination laws, so you must not knowingly discriminate anyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, there is a lot of thank you from different participants. I think that we answered all the questions. Okay, thank you for giving so much very interesting information and insightful answers. Thank you, Yulia and Veronica, for participating in this panel discussion. And thank you for Women Who Code London for organizing that, this kind of discussion.
You're welcome, and I was really happy to participate in this meeting and discuss so important question. And I hope that I help other people to know something new about this topic. And for example, from my experience, when I started to learn more about this topic, and especially in ML, in data science, and it opened for me really new page on of the life and I opened something new for me, and it was really especially for me it was useful, and I hope that it was useful for you too.
Thank you for inviting me. I also enjoyed that, and I learned a lot from what other people said, and from the questions, and from the preparation for the talk. And yeah, I think it's a very important topic to just, not just focus on the scores, but remember there is something human behind that. Yeah, I will try to do better.
Learning about biases is indeed painful. However, I don't think anyone would want to unlearn about them. So we must be aware of them to make our lives better. Thank you, Veronica, Yulia, and Mariana for delivering this amazing panel discussion. Thank you all for joining. And as usual, I will follow up with an email and on social media. Stay tuned.